Hello class, and welcome to this video that I'm calling Minor Scales, Construction, and Variation. And we'll go through each of those words as it applies to the minor scale. But suffice it to say, this is not really an introduction to the minor scale. You should have already read your chapter at this point to have an idea of the minor scale. But it is going to go over these two important facets, construction and variation for the minor scale. Now, the minor scale is kind of the flip side or the shadow side of the major scale. And so just like it's super important for you to really master your major scales, it's also going to be important for you to master your minor scales. Now, minor scales are actually trickier than major scales generally for a number of reasons. First of all, there's more variability in the minor scales. We're going to talk about this idea of being different forms, so to speak, of the minor scale. And also that constructing the minor scale requires previously mastering major mode. Now, it is possible to just memorize or to construct minor scales on their own, but that's not the main way that people usually do it. Usually when people construct a minor scale, they're thinking of the major scale first. So if you're not entirely solid on your major scales, I would recommend reviewing those before we go on and talk about constructing minor scales. That's a good segue into our first point for today, which is the two ways of constructing minor scales. Now, just like there were two methods of constructing the major scale, there are also two methods of constructing the minor scale, although they are not the same. Unlike the major mode, having either the intervallic pattern or this idea of two tetrachords isn't usually the way that people construct minor chords, so they're not the same methods as in the major scale. Rather, both of these methods that I'm going to teach you today derive from the major scale. So first, you're starting with a major scale of some sort, and then you're getting the minor scale out of that major scale. So let's talk about our first method, which is the parallel minor method. Now, the term parallel in parallel minor means that it's being derived from the same root or the same tonic as a major key. So, for example, think about it this way. You have the key of A major on the one hand, and there's also a key of A minor. So the two share the same tonic root of A. And in this sense, they run parallel to each other from A to A. However, the contents of these two scales are somewhat different, and that's what makes it a parallel major versus a parallel minor scale. So here's how you can construct a parallel minor scale from the major. So let's take A major and A minor since we are already talking about those. Go ahead and write out the A major scale. A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, A. There's your A major scale. Now find the 3rd, 6th, and 7th scale degree and lower them by a half step. So now let's think about A major, what your 3rd, 6th, and 7th scale degree are. You would have A, B, C sharp is your 3rd, D, E, F sharp is your 6th, G sharp is your 7th, and then back to A, which is your root 8 or 1. So you have C sharp, F sharp, G sharp. Now take all those and lower them by a half step. In other words, we're going from all three of those being sharp to all three of those being natural. In other cases, you might be going from natural to flat. Okay, so then take the scale with that lowered 3rd, 6th, and 7th, and what do you have? You have A, B, C natural, D, E, F natural, G natural, and A. Now notice that in this case, we took a key that has 3 sharps in the key signature, A major, and then we lowered 3 tones by a half step, which were precisely those that were already sharped. And so what we end up with is a key signature with no sharps or flats, and that would be A minor. So a good mnemonic to think of is that the minor key, the parallel minor key to any given major key, is always going to be 3 flat to this flat side of the circle of fifths diagram, since there are 3 notes that are being lowered. Now let's go ahead and hear on the piano what that would sound like. So here was the A major that we started with. And we took the 3rd scale degree and lowered it by half step. Took the 6th scale degree in the 7th scale degree. And now we have A minor. So this is what it sounds like all together. A, B, C natural, D, E, F natural, G natural, A. So now with that minor scale that we just heard, here's a consideration. The lowered 6th scale degree is now a tendency tone. It wants to go somewhere. So let's go ahead and listen to this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 5. Six, 5, 5. It has a strong tendency of wanting to go down to 5. And this is particularly characteristic of the sound of the minor mode. It sounds basically like a tragic sigh of 6 going down to 5, and that's something that many composers will exploit. Now, unlike the major mode, which had 4 and 7 as active tones, the 4 and 7 scale degrees in a minor scale are not as active. They're not as strong of tendency tones as they are in major. And that's because in the case of the 4, the half step that it wanted to go down to, the half step between 4 and 3, has now been widened to a whole step between 4 and then the lowered 3. So there's not quite as much what's called tonal magnetism there. And likewise, the 7th scale degree, which wanted to go up to the 1 as the leading tone, has now been lowered down to a 7th. So there's also not as much magnetism there since it's now a whole step apart. Okay, now let's go ahead and talk about the second method of constructing a minor scale, and that is using the relative minor. So we had parallel minor and relative minor. Now, parallel meant that the two keys shared the same tonic, but relative means that they share the same key signature or the same pitches, but they have a different tonic. So remember how in the parallel minor we ended up with A minor being a key signature with no sharps and no flats, just all naturals. Well, what's another key signature in the major that we know that has no sharps or flats, all naturals, or all white keys? So let's go ahead and play C major. There's C major running from C to C, but what if we did that exact same thing and just ran all the white notes on the keyboard, but instead of running from C to C, we ran from A to A. So here we go, C, B, A. Now run all the white keys. Guess what? We have A minor, the same A minor that we found using the parallel method before. So for all 12 major scales, which you can already construct and should be starting to memorize some of those by now, there is also a relative minor scale that runs from 6 to 6 of that same scale. So if you know all the pitches of, say, an E major scale, but then go down to the 6, and run from 6 to 6, those same pitches, you can get a minor scale. In this case, a C sharp minor scale, because it's running from C sharp to C sharp. So as you become more familiar with both your major and minor scales, using the relative method becomes an easy way to sort of shuttle between them. If you already are thinking of a major scale, you can go down to the 6th and run 6 to 6 for the minor scale. Or if you happen to know a minor scale pretty well, such as A minor, then you can run from 3rd to 3rd, A, B, C, and then run C to C, and that gets you to your relative major scale. So you can sort of toggle between them fairly easily. Now, the one thing that you do have to be careful of is that you use notes in terms of their accidentals that belong together in the same collection. So for example, when we were thinking of E major, we didn't go from E major down to C natural because we knew that C sharp was part of the E major scale and not C natural. Otherwise, we would have gotten rather strange results. By the same token, if we had C minor and we wanted to go up to the 3rd to run from the 3rd to the 3rd, we have to know that E flat belongs to the C minor, And so you would run from E flat to E flat, not from E natural to E natural. Now those are the two methods for constructing a minor scale. Go ahead and try them both out, figure out which one works best for you, either lowering 3, 6, and 7 for the parallel method, or by finding the parallel major and then running 6 to 6 in that key. Either way works, just find out which works best for you and then practice doing that. Now we need to move on and talk about a topic that's very important in the minor mode, and that is that the minor mode contains within it more variability than the major mode does. Now, I like to refer to the minor mode as the 9-note collection. And you might be wondering, how can it be a 9-note collection when we just built the scale and it has 7 scale degrees, just like the major scale? Well, that's because 2 of the scale degrees, 6 and 7, can have different forms. They can either be lowered, like we just learned, or they could also be raised, depending on the context. So minor mode has more variability built into it for expressive effect. Now the methods that we just used get you the natural minor scale. That is a minor scale with no chromatic alterations. You can see that because in A minor, which has no sharps or flats in the key signature, they were all white keys, so no chromatic alterations. However, as I mentioned, even though that's the natural form of the minor scale, hence why it's called natural minor, in certain situations, you will be raising scale degree 6 or 7 to achieve particular effects. So as you read in your book, there's a form called the harmonic minor scale, which has a raised 7th, so that you get the leading tone that's just a half step under the root and wants to resolve to the root. This is the same as if it were in the major scale, what the leading tone would be. So if we have A minor, the natural minor has no sharps or flats, but for the harmonic minor, we want to raise the 7th scale degree by a half step. So if we go up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, now we have our 7. Before we had G natural, but we want to raise that by a half step. So we get G sharp, and then we get A. So now we have that leading tone, G sharp, 7, or T, do, to the 1. Now for this form, which is known as the harmonic minor, it has a peculiarity in that you have F natural going to G sharp. F natural, G sharp, A. This is an interval known as an augmented second, which we'll learn more about next week. But suffice to say, it's a very odd interval, and very rarely would you go directly from the raised 7th to 6th. Like that. It sounds a little more exotic and is kind of part of this Orientalism trope that gets used in romantic music. Instead, what you might see is skipping between the 1 and the 5, but using the raised 7th and the lowered 6th as decorations. Alright, so that's the harmonic minor scale. Just raise your 7th to the leading tone, just like in major, and you have your harmonic minor scale. Check that you have the augmented second, and you're good to go. Now the melodic minor scale is the other form, and this one is a little bit more complicated. So in the melodic minor, you have that variability between 6 and 7 as either being able to be raised or lowered. But in the melodic minor scale, it changes depending on if you are ascending through the scale or whether you are descending through the scale. Now specifically, when you're going up, when you're ascending through the scale, you use the raised 6th and 7th scale degree. However, when you get to the top, back at the root, and then turn around to descend, that flips around and it becomes the lowered 7 and the lowered 6 scale degree again. So this is what that sounds like in A minor for the melodic minor form. There's your raised 6 and 7, 5, raised 6, raised 7th, 1. But then once you get to the top, it becomes lowered 6th and 7th again. So going up, now coming down. So here's one more time all the way through. First raised going up and then lowered coming down. So that's how you get what I call the 9-note collection, when there are two forms of the 6 and 7 being used, and so there are 9 notes altogether in this scale, the melodic minor. Now, when you're notating this, be sure that you reset the accidentals to be what the key signature is when you're coming down. So you'll need to make sure going up that you set the raised accidentals, whether those be sharps or naturals for 6 and 7, because they won't be in the key signature. And then when you get to the top and are coming back down, you'll need to reset those accidentals, whether those be by natural or by flat, to lower them again to the lowered 6th and 7th form of the natural minor. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of there being 3 minor scales versus this terminology of the 9-note collection that I use. And the reason I prefer saying it's a 9-note collection rather than saying there are 3 minor scales is because some of these versions of the minor scale are ones where nobody actually writes a piece in that scale. For example, you'll never see a sonata in a harmonic minor scale, just using the raised 7th. There are also no key signatures for harmonic or melodic minor scale. The only minor key signatures that you need to know or will ever see are those for the natural minor scales. So what that means is that the harmonic and the melodic minor scales, these forms, are really more context dependent. You use these raised, either just the raised 7th or the raised 6th and 7th, in specific circumstances. So the names are derived from the context in which they are used. The harmonic minor draws its name from the fact that it's used in chord progressions to raise the leading tone and give more of a powerful sense of tension and return to the tonic. So for example, in the progression 1-5-1, here's 1, here's 5 with the raised 7th, there's your T, raised 7th, and then going back to 1. That feels like a stronger chord progression, at least in the classical mindset, than the natural minor, which would be. So they want that T-do in order to give that sense of tension and return. As for the melodic minor, it derives its name from trying to avoid the awkward leap in the melody of the augmented second between the lowered 6th scale degree and the raised 7th if you want a leading tone. So notice when ascending through the melodic minor scale, there is no augmented second. Here you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you get whole step, half step. And same with on the way down, whole step, half step. Now, there's an important question here, which is, how do you know if you're just looking at a score example and you don't have the title? How do you know if you're looking at a major or minor key piece, since the key signature could be either for a major or its relative minor? So here are a few suggestions. First, look for what is functioning as a stable tone in the melody, or especially in the bass. What note is it usually going to finish on or maybe begin on that seems to be the most stable? Because that tone that is the most stable will probably be your tonic or your root. And if you see that really being emphasized, what would be the 6 in a major scale, then maybe you're actually in the minor, the relative minor of that major mode, rather than in the major key. Now, along with that, secondly, you can look for a tone that has a raising accidental that looks like it's functioning as your leading tone, going from 7 to 1. Now, this is because if you're in a major key, your leading tone 7 to 1 wouldn't have an accidental. It's all within the key signature. However, if you have leading tone 7 to 1 motion in minor key, like that harmonic minor scale, it's going to need an accidental in order to raise it. So if you see that with an accidental, that would actually tell you that you're in minor mode. And then lastly, in minor mode, you can expect to see a higher frequency of accidentals than in major mode music of the same time period and the same composer. And this is because minor mode has that variability in scale degree 6 and 7, and so you might see more accidentals raising it and then lowering it again, etc. And so if you see a lot of accidentals, that may be another confirming factor to your suspicion that you're looking at a minor mode piece. The final topic I want to talk about is the role that the minor mode often can play in sort of classical music elitism. Now, what we sometimes refer to in shorthand as classical music really just comes from a couple of centuries in range, which is known as the Common Practice period. And within this period, there were very specific conventions of composing in a minor mode that came up, which we now know as, for example, the harmonic minor or the melodic minor scale. However, many folk musics or popular music traditions, film music, video game music, and contemporary concert music do not necessarily follow these conventions. For example, you're not necessarily going to see the augmented second avoided, and so the 6th and 7th both be raised when you're going up in the melody. That's sort of specifically from that time range of the Common Practice period. Then there are other music traditions, such as jazz, that might actually leave that 7th scale degree unraised, use its natural form, sort of have a more cool and hip sound, and then have a completely different feel to their minor mode within a jazz context than the classical minor mode. So for example, this might be a way of doing a minor in a jazz piece. And then see how different that sounds from the classical 1-5-7-1 progression with the raised leading tone. So this is really important for you to hear from me as your classical music theory instructor. And that is that either way of doing it is not better, not worse, it's just a different way of doing things. So even though in this class, we're going to need to learn certain conventions, such as in the classical sphere having that raised 7th scale degree to make the leading tone. That's mostly just because of the program and because certain music that you're learning will be more within this classical sphere, and not because we think it's inherently better or worse. It's just the way that it is, and then learning the right tools to deal with that repertoire. Okay, with that caveat, we're going to draw this video to a close. Definitely remember those two ways of deriving a minor scale from the major scale, either the parallel or the relative major. And also remember that scale degrees 6 and 7 are going to be more variable than the others. Sometimes they're going to be raised, and sometimes they will be lowered. Let me know if you have any questions, and thank you for listening.